Hi, good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to tonight's Cooperative Party online event as part of our annual Cooperative Party Conference, which is online this year. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Richard McCready. I'm the Cooperative Party's political officer here in Scotland, and I'm really pleased to welcome you this evening as we continue with the online Cooperative Party Conference in this session on Scotland. We started last night with a session with Westminster parliamentarians. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to kick off with a few tips on how we can make this interactive for everybody to take part. Firstly, for those of you who may be hard of hearing, we are working with RNID to close caption this event. If you want to view this captioning, you need to enable it yourself by pressing the CC icon on the buttons tool panel of your phone or computer. This Zoom call is also being recorded. Many of our members cannot access it live, so we will make it available to view via the Co-op Party's YouTube channel. So if you don't want your image to be seen, remove yourself from the video and go to audio only. You have been muted to make the content of this call clearer by preventing interruptions any background noise. Only those speaking will have sound enabled. When it's your turn to speak, we'll send you a message asking you to unmute. After we've heard from today's speaker, we'll hold a question and answer session. Please post any questions or comments in the chat box, which is being moderated. Questions will be put to the speakers by Daniel Johnson, who is chairing the meeting this evening and who you'll be hearing from shortly. Please tweet about this event using the hashtag CoopConf21 and tag at Scott Coop Party or at Coop Party. And finally, just before we start, I want to emphasise that the Cooperative Party believes that our cooperative values should be reflected in our actions as well as our policies. We want all members and all event participants to feel safe, welcome and respected in our party. Please ensure you abide by this when making your contributions today. I look forward to hearing from them. So you've heard enough from me, and now I want to introduce Daniel Johnson MSP. Daniel is the Scottish Labour and Cooperative Party MSP for Edinburgh Southern, and along with Monica Lennon, he's the co-chair of the Scottish Cooperative Party's Parliamentary Group. I'm delighted that Daniel is chairing today's event. Over to you, Daniel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's great to be chairing this event, albeit virtually, at the Cooperative Party conference. I think, well, first of all, let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm obviously Daniel Johnson. I'm the MSP for Edinburgh Southern, a seat that I won in 2016, held with an increased majority at the last election. And a bit in line with that, I quite often find myself in Labour Party circles being the most positive person in the room, having been the person that made it the only Labour gain in the last election and having increased majority. And actually, what I'd like to spread that, because actually, while in the Labour Party we're very used to being talked down and the negative commentary, the Scottish Cooperative Party is going from strength to strength. We've had our best ever result in terms of the number of MSPs returned with 11 MSPs, so it makes us the majority of the group. I was hoping to say that makes us the most successful part of the Cooperative Party on a proportionate basis of all the parliaments, but I just checked and our Welsh colleagues, I think, just pip us at the post, which is highly frustrating, but I think in a sense, I think shows the strength and indeed the progress that the Cooperative Party is making. But it's not just at the election in which the Cooperative Party has been successful. If you look at the last year, the cooperative MSPs that we have include myself, Monica Lennon and Neil Bibby, all of whom managed to get bills passed through Parliament while in opposition. And I think that stands as testament, I think, very much to what Richard was just mentioning at the very end of his comments. Being a Cooperative Party member isn't just about, you know, a particular badge that we might want to wear, a particular affiliation. It's actually, I think, a mindset and a way of conducting ourselves, the way that we approach politics, which is to ensure that we empower people, that being the most fundamental idea, but also I think the principle of mutual respect and cooperation in the way we act. But above all, I think is an attitude that puts at the very heart of our politics actually delivering for people in real and practical ways. Indeed, one of the things I did in my first election was got T-shirts printed with an image of Clement Attlee with a quote of his, which I like, which is that we shall be judged by what we achieve, not by what we attempt. And in a sense, I think that is very much, I think, the maxim that sums up certainly my approach to politics, but I think also the cooperative approach to politics. So my colleagues and I will be, I think, both looking a little bit over the last year in terms of what we have been delivering in the Scottish Parliament, but also very much and squarely looking ahead. So I'll be asking each of my colleagues to really examine kind of what their thoughts are for not just the coming year, but actually the coming 5 years. And in the question and answer session, I'd also really like to open that up, both with a view to absolutely answering any questions that people might have. But I think what's really important is that we set with a very clear and positive agenda through this Parliament. So I'd be very grateful, very interested in thoughts and contributions that people might have about what they think the key issues will be over the coming 5-year parliamentary term, either in terms of campaign issues or in particular, given the success that we've had with members' bills, if people have particular issues or areas that they think that we should be carrying forward in future members' bills, it'd be very interesting to hear from people. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first of my parliamentary colleagues, and I'm just going to go in terms of the order of the list that I've got here. So I'm hoping Monica is primed and ready to go with her thoughts and contribution. I'll then go to Rhoda, and I'll finally come to Paul before we do the Q&A. Monica, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Daniel, just having a fight with the mute button there, and yes, I am unmuted. Thank you, Daniel, for kicking things off this evening, and it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new faces and new names for those who have their cameras off. My name is Monica Lennon. I am a Scottish Labour and Co-op MSP for Central Scotland region, and along with Daniel, delighted to be the co-chair of the Scottish Co-op Party Parliamentary Group. This term, I am spokesperson for Scottish Labour on net zero energy and transport, so very much thinking about COP26 and the opportunities that lie ahead. So tonight I've been asked to give you, I suppose, a short tour of our priorities as a co-op parliamentary group for the rest of the term, but hopefully tonight we can also hear some of your ideas that we can add to our work programme. And it was really lovely to hear Daniel begin so positively, reflecting on his own election success. I'm glad to be part of the starting 11 for the Co-op Party in the Scottish Parliament, and hopefully we can grow that and get some super subs as well, perhaps. But yeah, as ever, the Scottish Co-op Parliamentary Group will have a strong focus on growing the cooperative economy. So that means that we'll push for doubling the size of the co-op sector, recognising that cooperative enterprise is the fairest way to do business. We know that democratic organisations with a social purpose, operating in the interests of their members and the wider community, and sharing dividends of success fairly is the way to go. But key to this growth is access to grant and loan funding, and we know that's a major barrier to new co-ops starting up and also to existing co-ops expanding. So we want to see tax incentives and a review of the laws which disadvantage cooperatives against companies. My colleague Richard Leonard has raised this in the last Parliament, but we also want to look to Italy, where the Mercora law gives workers access to financial resources and business support to buy out their company if it's being sold or is at risk of closure. And we're proud to stand against tax avoidance as a party. For too long, tax havens and legal loopholes have enabled large multinational companies to shift profits around the world and get away with paying less than their fair share of tax. Fairer taxes means a fairer economy. So we will use our time in Parliament and out with Parliament to fight to put an end to tax havens, to make multinationals pay taxes in the country where they make their profits. That would raise at least £13.5 billion a year for the UK alone. And this means billions more to fund our vital public services like the NHS, social care and local government. Fairer taxes also make it fairer for our high streets and town centres, where local businesses struggle to compete with the tech giants like Amazon. Revitalising our high streets is an issue that's close to my heart as a former town planner and very relevant to my local communities right now. In the last week or so, Marks and Spencer have announced they're going to withdraw from Hamilton Town Centre, where I live, and we're likely to see a domino effect from that. Local businesses are very concerned about a further fall in footfall. So now is the time to explore cooperative models of ownership and new approaches to land use planning, to how we plan our high streets, because we really need to rejuvenate our local economies. And the Co-op Party wants to deliver a people's railway, and this falls into my portfolio as net zero energy and transport spokesperson. We're seeing the results of deep service cuts and a long disrespect for rail workers manifesting as an immovable barrier to a modern, efficient and green public transport revolution, issues that were raised in the Scottish Parliament just yesterday. And rather than continuing with our current model, where the state is called upon to act as a breakdown service for dysfunctional franchises, the Co-op Party has explored a model of democratic public ownership. We know our railways could be run by accountable, not-for-profit train service providers. And this would mean passengers and rail workers would have a real say in the running of services, their priorities for investment and even on executive pay. And I've mentioned COP26, probably the most significant issue of our generation is climate change and our need for a just transition to net zero. And the Co-op Party stands firmly with workers. Tackling climate emergency will require considerable economic change, and that change must benefit workers and communities. It must be fair and it must be just. Right now, the financial benefits from fossil fuels goes to a small number of shareholders, but it's the rest of us who feel the effects as the planet suffers under a changing climate. It's inspiring that so many of the green energy businesses of the future are cooperatives, with community energy co-ops leading the way here in Scotland and across the world, ensuring that workers and communities benefit from our journey towards net zero. A credible energy plan must involve a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And decision-making must directly involve workers, trade unions and communities. Ahead of COP26, we should be leading the way and investing in green community-owned energy, not approving further oil exploration and development. Finally, I want to draw attention to my colleague Rhoda Grant's work on enshrining the right to food in Scots law. We've already heard from Daniel about the importance of members' bills and the success that Scottish Labour and Co-op MSPs have had. The UN Sustainable Development Goals form part of our obligations to supporting countries in the Global South. Less well known is that they apply domestically. The second Sustainable Development Goal is zero hunger by 2030. Despite this obligation, food poverty appears to be increasing, not decreasing, with 8 million people in the UK having trouble putting food on the table. and over 500,000 people having used food banks in the last year. Just let that sink in. So incorporating Sustainable Development Goal 2 into domestic law would send a powerful signal about the UK and Scotland's commitment to addressing food poverty. So I'm delighted that Rhoda Grant is here with us tonight, and I look forward to hearing more from Rhoda next. So Daniel, that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Cooperative Parliamentary Group's priorities for the next 5 years. Haven't covered absolutely everything, and we do want to be in listening mode tonight and hear some questions later on. But thank you for listening so far, and Daniel, I will hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. And really, I think we should just all, just mark the real success Monica had in the last parliamentary term, getting her bill to tackle period poverty. I mean, I think it was definitely landmark legislation, and that is not to I think overemphasize that point at all. So we now come to our next speaker, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Rhoda Grant. If you note a particularly respectful tone in my voice, that's because Rhoda is our chief whip in the group. So I will tolerate absolutely no jokes, and anyone even entertaining such an idea will be shot down very quickly. Rhoda is taking forward, as Monica already mentioned, a member's bill to bring forward the right to food in the Scottish Parliament, and I think that is what she will be largely concentrating on, but I'm sure she'll have comments about the Parliament ahead as well. Rhoda, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, I'm unmuted, and Daniel, thank you very much for the grovelling. I very much appreciate it. It's good to be here tonight, and I'll really concentrate my comments on the right to food and why and where we are, I guess. Monica pointed out that we all have a right to food under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but despite this, we know people are going hungry and malnourished in Scotland, and that's happening in increasing numbers. So the right to food is not just about things like the right to free school meals. In fact, it's not about access to food banks or the like. It's about a right to good, nutritious food in one's own right. Therefore, the implementation of the right needs to review the entire food system in Scotland, because too often those, and people in this meeting tonight will know this, too often those producing our food can't afford a nutritious diet or even access to the very food they produce themselves. So it requires a review of our pay and our benefit system, and to make sure that people have enough money to buy the food that they need in order to live a healthy life. And of course, the right to food does have an element of state intervention in it. At times of crisis, the state should intervene to ensure people have food. Things like community food deliveries during the pandemic, intervention during food shortages, wartime, things like rations, all those kind of things. The state has to intervene to make sure that people have food to eat at times of crisis. But crisis intervention should be just that, only in a crisis. The rest of the time, people should have the ability to, at their own hand, have access to a healthy diet. And it's not just about being able to afford food. Last week, we heard the desperately sad case of an elderly woman who had died of starvation. Now, it wasn't entirely clear that that was due to lack of money. It seemed to me, reading between the lines, that it looked more as if she was physically unable to go and access food. So the right to food would force us to make provision for those who can't actually physically go and access the food themselves. And therefore, this policy can't be implemented and can't work simply by enshrining the right in Scottish law. It has to be accompanied by a vehicle that will ensure its implementation. And we also know that we have a health crisis due to malnutrition. We hear of people developing diseases that we all thought were consigned to history. Obesity is stealing years of people's lives. And we all know that you can't learn when you're hungry, and you can't aspire to a better life if you're starving. So we also know that you're likely to die of COVID if you're malnourished. That's something that has been recently revealed to us all. We also know that obesity is not about overeating. It's about malnutrition. Cheap food is high in fat, it's high in sugar, but very low in nutrients. So, however, if your family's hungry, bulk and affordability trumps nutrition, and many people are forced down the road of that very, very unhealthy diet. We also know that hunger affects your metabolism. Our bodies are designed to preserve our lives. So at a time of famine, we store fat ready for the next famine. So all those things, Elaine Smith and I were talking about and deciding that we needed to act in the last Parliament. So I was putting pressure on the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs to include the right to food as part of the Good Food Nation bill. And that was a bill that was promised in the last Parliament, but continually delayed, and excuses were made. So Elaine consulted on a member's bill enshrining the right to food in Scottish law. And I would have to say that the Co-op party were instrumental here in getting individual members of the public to respond. And that led to a large number of responses, especially for a member's bill. But it became clear that the government were not going to legislate on a Good Food Nation bill, and it was equally clear if they ever did, they wouldn't be enshrining the right to food in it. And I believe, and I think many people believe, that the right clearly belongs within a Good Food Nation bill. And as I said, Elaine's consultation was not just about enshrining the right to food, it was making sure that there was a body there that was able to ensure that that right was available to people in Scotland, and in fact, more appropriate, I think, was the body tasked to implement the right than indeed the right itself. So we need a body that is independent of government, because this aspect covers a huge raft of government policies, but the body overseeing it would need to be independent, but also have the ability to make suggestions and to look at what the government was doing across the entirety of policy. So the response to Elaine's consultation, I believe, was clear, and indeed the same response came to the Scottish Government's Good Food Nation bill, saying that not only should we be enshrining the right, but the vehicle for implementation was very much at the forefront of what we needed to do. And Elaine's bill fell at the end of the session because it had run out of time, but at that point it had cross-party support. So I picked up the bill and asked the Parliament for permission to continue to table a draft bill based on Elaine's consultation. And that was remitted to the Human Rights Committee this week, and they looked at it on Tuesday. But sadly, the government parties voted en bloc to stop it happening. Now, this wouldn't have meant that the bill would have overwritten anything the government was doing. If they had passed it and I had tabled a bill, the government could have taken that over. So they were actually trying to kick it into the long grass. They were trying to delay this bill, and I think that is absolutely appalling. And I am absolutely convinced that I need to go, therefore, and consult again and bring forward a bill, because trying to stall, trying to get rid of the bill that way is certainly not right. And if anybody ever tells you again that we have a progressive government in Scotland, remember what they did to this bill, because that is not progressive. And in fact, I believe that their argument that they'll legislate is spurious, because, as I said, they could have taken over the bill. And that what really concerns me is that they didn't go down that stage. And I wonder if they actually intend to legislate at all and hence they're kicking it into the long grass. So I'll be looking for your support again, as you supported Elaine, with the consultation, making sure people respond. And I think together we can actually implement this into Scottish law, and more importantly, the vehicle that will deliver it. Thank you, Daniel. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, I'd muted myself and then I realized I wasn't able to unmute myself without permission. Well, look, I was at this point, before I introduce our final speaker, I was going to put the audience on notice that they had to think up questions, because I gather that our Westminster colleagues managed to bore the audience into submission and have no questions at the end of the talk whatsoever. But I'm glad that we've already got our first question. So thus far, without actually having completed the speakers, we are beating the MPs, which I am very pleased about indeed. Now, it's with both pleasure and a degree of regret that I introduced our last speaker, Paul O'Kane. Regret because Paul, as a newbie MSP, is here to remind me and Monica that we are no longer our shiny new MSPs. And that's the only downside from the last election that I can think of. But it's great to have Paul in the group. And indeed, I think one of the things that I have really noticed since the election is, with a big influx of new MSPs in the Labour group and indeed the Labour and Cooperative group, I think there's a new sort of energy and dynamism within the Scottish Labour benches. And I think that's really exemplified no better than Paul O'Kane, who has come from local government, but I think has a kind of real, sense of direction in the Parliament, and is certainly, I think, acquitting himself incredibly well in the chamber. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Daniel. It was a very kind introduction, and it's really great to be here at Cooperative Party Conference, albeit online, to share some thoughts this evening. And it really is wonderful to follow such great colleagues, not least because when you're the last speaker on a panel, you can pinch everyone's ideas and what they've said before you, which is great. But no, I think the serious point for me is that I am very fortunate to work alongside so many excellent fellow cooperators in the parliamentary group. And as Daniel said in his opening remarks, that group has swelled in number, which is wonderful. And I think there is a real desire to bounce off one another and to work together and to really put cooperative values at the heart of everything we do. So for me, coming in and being able to look at the record of achievement, certainly in the past Parliament, it really gives me strong foundations, and I am learning a huge deal from all of you as well. I think Richard kind of sent me the exam questions for tonight. He said, a bit of a reflection on being a new MSP and why I wanted to be, I suppose, a cooperative MSP as well as Labour. And also, I think, to look ahead at what some of our priorities might be in the next 5-year period. And for me, at its heart, being a cooperative councillor as I am, and indeed now a cooperative MSP, it's always been about making sure that we get people at the heart of the decisions we make, and particularly around how we build an economy that works for everyone. And for me, that's about people having a fair share and a stake in the economy and in the businesses that impact upon their lives. And I've seen that probably firsthand in the communities that I've served on the council, because all too often I think people in local communities feel like decision-making is taken away from them, that power becomes increasingly more and more centralised, and that we don't have institutions, and particularly businesses and communities, that are democratic and accountable. And I think, Monica made reference to the challenges we experience in our town centres, for example. I think people feel very detached from what is happening in their town centres and their communities, and feel that they don't have a stake in the planning process around the types of services that are available to them. So, for me, there's something really fundamental in being a cooperative MSP to help to start to shift some of that and change some of that. And as I say, work with colleagues to really turn the systems on their head and make them reflect more accurately, I think, our values as cooperators. I will want to say something tonight, I think, about the council elections that are coming up next year as well, because I think they're a really vital, an important test, certainly for the party. And indeed, I think we want to see that strong cooperative representation in our councils. And I think that's vitally important, because as a cooperative councillor, I have been in a small group, but I think what we've been able to do in our council is start to make officers think differently, and starting to really consider cooperatives as an option, and starting to think about how we embed cooperative values into what we're trying to do in administration. And it's not always easy, because very often officers are really stretched. We know that our services and councils are really stretched, and we know that our councils have been underfunded by the government. But trying to get officers to think outside the box, I think, is really important. We've done that in East Renfrewshire. And we're starting to look at a number of innovative things. Colleagues across local government are doing excellent work on this. I think we need to look no further than North Ayrshire to see the work that's been done around community wealth building there, as a real exemplar of what Labour can do in power. I think that's something that colleagues across local authorities can learn from, about really using anchor institutions in communities to regenerate and rebuild, and to keep money in the local economy, becoming a more circular economy, and becoming an economy that works for the people who live in a community. So, I think there's lots of opportunity as we begin to think and develop ideas coming into next year's council elections about how we put those ideas and agendas front and centre of local manifesto building. Within the Parliament, I am delighted to be serving as our spokesperson on public health and social care, and also as deputy convener of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. And I suppose I mentioned that role because I think it has a real synergy with what Rhoda has just said around the right to food, and the excellent work that Rhoda's carried on from Elaine in that bill. I think absolutely, we know that non-communicable diseases, we know that childhood obesity, we know these challenges exist, but we know that the root causes of these are poverty, and often access to the basic human rights of food, and the right support to access food. So for me, there's a real public health imperative in the work that we're doing around this, and making sure that this can have that wider impact in tackling many of the public health crises that we had even before COVID, that have now been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think we've seen real support for a lot of this work when evidence has been brought before committee, as we begin to think about the sorts of priorities we're going to have. We've heard evidence from a variety of third sector partners and charities who tell us that this would be a fundamental shift, and be able to really change things in terms of tackling those non-communicable diseases. So for me, that's going to be a real priority as the Health and Sport Committee really looks at its work, is to see how we can continue to push the agenda and support Rhoda in the work that she's doing now to renew the bill and to take it forward. In terms of other priorities for me within the Parliament, as I say, I know I follow in the footsteps of cooperators who've made real and lasting changes with Private Members Bill. I think we need to do more to really support cooperatives, I think, to flourish in Scotland. I think for too long, this current government have put the support for new cooperatives on the back burner. The SNP talk big, but they act in a very small way. For me, there's something fundamental in how we shape our town centres, as I've said, and our communities. The SNP talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods. What does that really mean? Nobody's quite clear. What is the definition of a 20-minute neighbourhood? What is the role within that for community ownership and community social enterprise and business? I've not seen any real detail on that, but if you look at communities in my region, in Port Glasgow and Inverclyde, that town centre now does not have a post office in it, and it's not a small town. It doesn't have any access to cash because all of the banking facilities have closed. It doesn't have a citizens advice bureau. It doesn't have many of the services that we would see in other towns. And what has replaced a lot of these services are more and more fast food takeaways and more betting shops and things like that. So who is really taking that strong focus to look at the mix of what's on our high streets and where there is a place for community ownership to come in and provide some of these services that are so relied upon. And linking, I think, to the whole agenda around food, many years ago when I worked in the voluntary sector, there were lots of excellent initiatives around bringing good, affordable, high-quality food into communities through food co-ops that were supported through health and social care partnerships that use local volunteers and local expertise to deliver those services. A lot of that has now gone by the wayside because of funding cuts. And so we do have to have a really honest conversation about that, about how we advance that going forward. I think there are other opportunities as well around childcare that we're not really, the government, really keen to promote their 1140 hours of free early learning and childcare. I'm not sure that cooperative models of childcare existed anywhere really in that, in terms of third sector providers and also parent-led childcare. We know there are many toddlers groups, there are many informal childcare arrangements that could be supported to become cooperative and to really offer a service in a community. That hasn't happened and it hasn't been advanced or supported by this government. So I think we have a role, because we all know that childcare will continue to expand, but we want to see that flexibility and those models offered as well. As I say, I stand between all of your questions and ideas, and I think, as Daniel says, we're really keen to hear those. As a new MSP, I am desperate to get people's ideas so that we can raise them in the chamber, so we can think about what other sorts of members' bills we might want to take forward. But for me, it's about how do we put cooperatives back at the heart of communities? How do we link that to community wealth building? And what I would say about next year's council elections is we are all determined to get behind our Labour co-op candidates to ensure that we put more Labour and co-op councillors into our city chambers and town halls, and to ensure that that agenda flows right down throughout our country, and essentially we get power closer to people so that they feel that they do have a genuine stake in the communities and neighbourhoods where they live. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I think we've already got 3 questions in the chat already. Thank you very much for people that have submitted them. For those that have not submitted their questions already, if you just want to bring up the chat and use that, that's the way to submit them. And I guess I'd make two pleas. For those of you who perhaps are unfamiliar with Scottish Parliament and Scottish politics from other parts of the UK, please feel free to ask questions about perhaps the differences between the way the political dialogue, political discourse is, whether there's a difference between particular issues between Scotland and the rest of the UK and the way that those works. Indeed, questions about the future of Scotland and the way that maybe the UK Labour Party, the UK Cooperative Party needs to think about Scotland. Happy to answer those questions. Likewise, maybe perhaps for those people with more familiarity, I think the key question really is, what are your thoughts about the coming 5 years? Where are the opportunities for us as a movement? And also the key issues that need to be addressed. I think we've touched on some of those, but we've certainly not exhausted them. So please bring up the chat, put your questions, thoughts, and I'd be happy to answer them. So I'll just come to the first one, and I'm going to, hopefully you don't mind me interpreting some of the questions. So the first question is from Grigory Donosi, and apologies if I've mispronounced your name, asking whether there's a difference between working in Scotland and the United Kingdom, and whether or not there are different employment contracts. And I'm actually going to pull that out and I'm going to interpret that, because there's a narrow way of answering that, which is no, employment law is reserved and therefore there is no difference. But I think it begs 2 interesting questions, which I'm going to pitch at 2 of my colleagues. I think first is, maybe about how we can use the powers that we've got within the Parliament. Because while we don't have competence for employment law, there are things that can be done. I think secondly is we are committed to devolution of employment law as the Labour Party, and I think that begs a question of, well, how should we be thinking about devolution going forward? So that first part, Monica, I was maybe going to come to you, because especially having looked after the local government brief and thinking about procurement. And when it comes to kind of employment, I mean, how do you think we can really push the SNP in terms of improving terms and conditions for working people in Scotland?
I was just waiting for permission to unmute. It's a really important question, especially right now in the pandemic, when we know that fire and rehire is on the increase and workers' terms and conditions are under huge threat. So there is a lot that we can do in Scotland. There's a lot that the Scottish Government can do, but also there's a lot that local government can do. So we have the Fair Work Convention in Scotland, and that's been in place since 2015, and it acts as an independent advisory body to Scottish ministers. And the Scottish Government wants Scotland to be a fair work nation by 2025, but we're not on track to achieve that. And that's because, as Paul was alluding to, the SNP do talk big and they talk progressive, but when it comes to action, they are quite timid, and there's a lot of spin. There's not a lot of action. So as Labour and Cooperative MSPs, this is an area where we will really be pushing the Scottish Government. Will continue to do that in parliamentary committees. We'll use our debate time to do that. In terms of fair work, there's a lot that can be achieved through procurement and conditionality. So we don't think that public contracts should be given out to companies and organisations that don't treat their workers properly. So yeah, sometimes it feels like we look to Westminster and we see that the government is sitting on its hands when it could legislate to outlaw practices like fire and rehire, which are absolutely abhorrent. But there's a lot that we can do here in the Scottish Parliament to mitigate some of the worst effects of that. And actually, if we properly funded local government in Scotland, we probably could see much more innovation, creativity about how contracts are awarded too. But after what is now is it 14 years of the SNP being in charge, it feels like we're like a broken record on these issues. Rhoda, who's been in the Parliament longer than myself and Daniel and Paul, has been making these arguments for a long time. But what we do need is we need that solidarity between cooperators, between trade unionists, between working people, because people's rights are under attack. And we're hearing a lot of sort of a rhetoric in the Parliament about people should feel grateful that they have a job and not demand more, and to put up with bad terms and conditions. But we absolutely have to fight against that. And as cooperators, that's absolutely key to our values. Daniel?
Thank you, Monica. Rhoda, I was also wondering if I could maybe just put the second part of that question as I framed it, and especially as somebody who was elected in that first election in '99, you've seen the devolved powers change. I mean, what do you think that we should be doing, both in terms of within the scope of the current powers, but also potentially looking at maybe how we want to change and evolve the devolved settlement and potentially assume new powers with regard to employment and rights at work? And can I also sneak, there's another question specifically, which I'll put to you right now, from from another member, asking what members can do to promote the right to food. So I'll maybe ask you to slip in an answer on that as well.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And I think a lot of the things that Monica said in answer to the first question are relevant. And I guess when the Parliament started, when I was in the first Parliament, devolution of employment law was not top of our agenda, because we had a Labour government in Westminster that was promoting good employment conditions and indeed trade union rights and all the things that we would stand beside. But today we had a Conservative government in the press talking about that it is not the benefit system that should be ensuring people are paid properly, it should be employers, which sounded pretty hollow from the man who could change the minimum wage at the movement of a pen, and he wasn't willing to do that. So, you know, that is just a lie. He's quite happy that people are driven by poverty wages, and that's what's changed for us, I think. When Labour was in power in Westminster, we weren't pushing for this, but as we've seen more and more, the UK government really erode employment and, you know, people's conditions of work and conditions of service and the like. I think that has really pushed for us to be much more on the front foot about looking for devolved powers over this, because we fought for a devolved parliament because it was to mitigate when the Conservatives were in power, to mitigate their actions, and I think having those powers would allow us to do that. Turning quickly to the right to food, the Co-op Party was instrumental in ensuring there was a huge number of individual responses to Elaine Smith's consultation. Now, I will need to go out and consult again, so that help would be really, really important if members were willing to respond to the consultation, but also encourage others to do it and use social media to promote the consultation when it's out. Now, it probably will be towards the beginning of December before that's issued. I have 2 months to issue it, but we need to review the consultation document and update it. But your help doing that, both through your circles and connections, but also through social media, would be very much appreciated.
Great. Now I'm just going to reassure Izzy, I am going through the questions slightly out of sequence, but there is method in my madness. There's a question here addressed to Paul, which I think is really interesting, one that is very dear to my heart. So the question is, what can councils do to revitalise our high streets and make sure that post offices and banks are there? Paul.
Thanks, Daniel. You know, I think it's about the council acknowledging that it is one of those anchor institutions that I spoke about. And I referred to the community wealth building agenda in North Ayrshire. And I think the council really taking seriously its role as the anchor. And that's about looking at the town centre anew in terms of where our council services located within town centres that will bring people into town centres and communities, but also then pulling the other partners in who might be anchors in a town. You know, whether that be NHS, whether that be university, whether that be colleges as well. And I think both the college sector and the university sector would also acknowledge their role as anchor institutions in a lot of our town centres. You know, so for me, it's about all of those organisations understanding that they have a role to play in terms of the revitalisation of our communities. And also considering how we bring more people into town centres. So through a good housing mix, looking at the local plan, looking at planning policy about how you help more people to live in town centres, and getting away, I think, from what was often quite innovative 1960s and 70s, Monica will keep me right on this, 60s and 70s town centre living, which very rapidly became kind of substandard and inappropriate and in the wrong place, and very often kind of poorly maintained, and I think ran down a lot of housing within town centres. So the council's got a role, I think, in that. But then I think what they also have a role to do is to play a leadership role in supporting local businesses, small businesses, to, you know, be sustainable in town centres. And I suppose I'll look to Daniel for advice on this, but I think it is about supporting those communities of small businesses to thrive by you know, business improvement districts can work really well. They can work not so well in other places, but it's looking at initiatives like that. It's looking at initiatives where there are incentives for small businesses to be in town centres and to support that community wealth building agenda by helping keep money in the local economy, and whether that's jobs for local people, whether that's the ability for local people to spend, whether that's you know, coffee shops doing the basic thing of, loyalty cards in terms of local customers. These sorts of things can be incentivised and supported by councils. And I think also, looking at that cooperative model of ownership, so very often post office services leave communities because they're no longer, they don't make money for very often shop owners. So they're not attractive, but actually they might be attractive to someone who wants to try something different and in a variety of settings. And similarly with banking services, we need to look at where these services can be provided in a more attractive setting. And for us as cooperators, we would want to see that in businesses that are willing to trial those community-led businesses.
If people don't mind, I think I might just add my 10 cents worth on this as well. I think there are two really important things to add to what Paul has said. I think first of all is, I think what's really vital is that we retain kind of the town centres as a centre for economic activity. I think all too often, I think when people talk about town centre regeneration, or and people talk about placemaking, the assumption is that somehow the shops will go and will do other things, but actually when you drill into what those other things are, they're very often activities which don't actually entail employment, and that would be extremely damaging. Retail and consumer-facing businesses in our town centres are a really important source of employment, and what's more, the sorts of businesses that actually really anchor community. So I think retaining that economic focus for our town centres is really critical. And then the second point, something that was already alluded to by Monica, which is that we really need to look at taxation. So at the moment, the burden of non-domestic rates falls on high street retail, and that needs to actually shift to reflect the economic reality of both, I think, to some extent, out of town, but then especially kind of non-physical retailers. And I think we all know the big one that we're talking about. And that could actually be done quite quickly. You could actually do an interim step of adjusting the non-domestic rates regime so that we could actually tax the Amazons of this world without primary legislation as an interim step before you actually introduce a revised non-domestic rates regime. But I think those are two really important elements, both in terms of that economic focus, but actually also making sure that we have a taxation regime that supports town centres rather than acts as an impediment to them. So we're going to take one more main question before we do a sort of a little final summing up, which I'll be incorporating one of the other questions into that. Now, the next question I'm going to take is important for two reasons. First of all, I think it's on a topic that is, I think, really central to Labour, which is what are the panel's thoughts on the current national care service consultation? And I think what I might ask is each of the panel to give some thoughts on this, because I think it is so important. The other reason is an important question is because it's come from Rita Miller, and all Scottish cooperators will know why that's so important. I don't know who wants to go first. I mean, thoughts on National Care Service, I think particularly coming from a cooperative perspective. Does anyone want to go first? Rhoda?
Yep, happy to go first. I think the crux of what's wrong with the current consultation and what we would do is that the Scottish Government are really looking at a national care service which is identical to the care service we have, but they hold the power. So it's a centralisation of the current care service. And we in the Labour Party would have done something totally different. And that was in our manifesto. I think we all believe that there has to be a care service that reflects people's needs, but has the same standards of care, the same standards of employment wherever you are. So I think that is the main crux of the difference of what we're doing. It's not, they're just doing simple centralisation, and we need local government involved at the forefront, communities involved at the forefront of the care that is delivered locally for them.
Paul, would you like to go next? What are your thoughts as we...
Thanks, Daniel. I obviously hold the social care brief within the health team. And, I think Rhoda's absolutely right. We first proposed this, Labour first proposed this 10 years ago, and we welcome all converts, whoever late, in terms of the SNP. But the reality is what the SNP want to do is centralise and get really focused on structure and putting more layers onto health and social care partnerships, because actually I'm not sure that in a lot of places integration has worked as well as it should or could have, and all they want to do is tinker around with the structures. For us in Labour and in the Cooperative Party, it has to be about people, and that's about people who receive care services having a real stake in the services that that are created, but also it's about workers. We are still in the midst of, the Cabinet Secretary, Hamza Yousaf, announced yesterday that he's going to deliver a pay increase up to £10 for care workers, as though, that was just so wonderful and care workers should be so grateful for it. These are people who have gone over and above every single day of the pandemic, putting their own lives at risk. And I don't think it is out of reach to ask for £15 an hour for these care workers. The reality is that they are so valuable and they do an amazing job. So we need to focus on people and not get bogged down in structure. And I think Rhoda's right. We would have done something dramatically different in terms of giving people a voice at the table and a vote.
Thank you, Paul. Monica, what are your thoughts on the National Care Service proposals?
Well, I have concerns that we're still in the pandemic and we're not yet learning all of the lessons. Just this week I had to comment on some local press analysis of how many people were discharged from hospital either with COVID, known to have COVID, or not tested at all, and were placed into care homes or back into care homes. And it's one of the biggest mistakes that happened. And that's against the backdrop of care workers, those on the front line, saying this is dangerous and this shouldn't be happening. So I think at the heart of it, there are big issues here about workforce. We can't just shift power from public health directors, from individual care homes to ministers, and wish that all these problems are going to go away. And fundamentally, on the issues around workforce, around pay, about training, about development, I think we have to recognise that there are huge gender inequalities, there are structural labour market inequalities where it's women who've been doing the majority of this work and have been undervalued for decades. And also when it comes to families, it's mostly women who are being asked to pick up, I don't want to say the burden of care, because that's not the appropriate term, but it sometimes feels like it's a burden for people because they're getting absolutely no help. So I think I would echo both Rhoda and Paul. It's not the way we would have approached it, but we need to hear much more from the people who receive care and the people who deliver it. I would just make one final plug for Anne's Law, because I think if everyone in this call emailed at MSP about Anne's Law, we're working on the government's consultation right now about what a national care service could look like. There are people today who won't be allowed to receive visits from their family caregivers into the care home. And the care home isn't an institution. It shouldn't be an institution. That is the person's home. But right now, people's rights are still being constrained, and lots of public health experts are being ignored about infection prevention control. So I feel very worried about it, Daniel, that there was a big rush from the Scottish Government to try again to appear to be on the front foot, to appear to be progressive, and they've rushed this out. And I do worry about the Minister, Kevin Stewart, about his ability to take this forward. I don't mean to be unkind, but I have concerns.
I'm looking forward to the debate, Monica.
Yeah, well, we're all big fans of Kevin Stewart, I'm sure. And indeed, let me just be slightly indiscreet. At a recent meeting that I had with Kevin, he described as the big advantage of the National Care Service is that he will have the ability to direct care services, which I think speaks volumes as to, I think, what their priorities are. But the critical point, and I think this is worth just drawing out a little bit, some of the things that Paul was saying in particular, just for people that are unfamiliar with the way the structures work in Scotland, essentially integrated joint boards sit between local councils and local health boards. So there are boards comprised of those two bodies. So they are 2 steps removed already. And just to exemplify why they may not be the best structure to build this upon, and I note that Leslie Cameron has joined the call. In Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Integrated Joint Board is currently trying to drive through proposals that will close most of the care homes in Edinburgh. And this is the body that's apparently going to be entrusted with taking forward the National Care Service in this local area. I think there's a lot of reasons to feel that essentially expanding the existing structure isn't necessarily going to work. I think there are, to my mind, huge problems in terms of democratic accountability, in terms of the way decisions are made by integrated joint boards and for whom. And I think that's the key question as cooperators. And I think what we've all been saying is that what has to be at the heart of this is to ensure that those people receiving care are empowered and are able to make decisions and shape the care that they receive, and those who work in them are valued and empowered in their work. And at the moment, I don't see anything that gives me the confidence that that's what's going to happen. So look, we are now gone past 8 o'clock. There's still loads of excellent questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to sum up, but I'm going to pitch 2 questions and if you can weave these into your summing up, that would be great. So the 2 questions how can we achieve the aim of doubling the number of cooperatives in Scotland through the course of the next Parliament? And the next one, coming from Joe Fagan, so this question's got good pedigree, is, given the challenges that are faced by local government, such as funding and net zero, how can we apply cooperative ideas as we look forward to the local government elections in Scotland next year? So I think those are 2 excellent questions to use as the basis of summing up. So look, I might just go in the reverse order that went in from the start of this. So I'll start with Paul and work through to Monica. Paul, what's your thoughts? Doubling cooperatives and local government elections and cooperative ideas.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to the Co-op Party for an excellent event, and to all the staff who have been working hard to put this conference on. For me, I think it's about pressing the government in terms of funding to look at cooperative initiatives. We know that Cooperative Scotland, we've seen a reduction in funding. We know that the cooperative education service, we've seen reductions in funding there. So I think we need to really push the government in terms of funding the bodies that will drive innovation in terms of creating more co-ops. I think also in my remarks, I touched on some of the areas where I think there is real potential for growth in cooperative models. So I think every time that we have a policy initiative brought forward, we need to put that cooperative lens on it and to ask what's been considered in terms of funding the creation of more cooperatives. And again, I would point to childcare as being a big policy innovation where we just haven't seen that development. And I know there are plenty of groups out there who could very easily pivot to become cooperatives with the right support and the right kind of startup funding. So for me, there's something in that. I think in terms of Joe's question about looking ahead to local government elections, and Joe's doing a great job with the team in South Lanarkshire. I think it is about how we design local manifestos, but we get the right support to candidates and labour groups and labour co-op candidates to be forming these ideas and realistic ideas, I think, about what works on the ground. And there's some really good examples of where labour and co-op councillors are in positions of power, but also where labour co-op councillors have made innovations in opposition as well, and have pushed council officers into doing more. So people need those really concrete examples so they can put them into their manifestos and then put them into the future programme of work when hopefully we return labour and co-op councillors and labour administrations across the country.
Thank you, Paul. Rhoda, what's your thoughts on those two objectives? Oh, can someone unmute Rhoda, please?
I'm not getting the hang of it. The unmute, because a message comes up and then I'm trying to unmute myself at the same time. With regard to co-ops, I think Co-op Development Scotland really needs to be given a push. It sits within Scottish Enterprise, but frankly, I don't think it has really achieved anything that was set up out to do. So I think they need to be empowered, and they also need to have targets to reach out to people. Land reform is my brief in the Scottish Parliament, so I see much more community ownership of land, not just in rural areas, but within urban areas as well, because we're seeing areas totally ignored. And if we got community ownership in there, we could turn places around and build economies in inner cities. And we're talking about high streets and the like earlier. I think there is real space for community ownership. And given the pandemic, a lot of people have started setting up micro businesses. I think there is the ability for those micro businesses to come together into co-ops and to market themselves as much as anything, using social media and the like, but also looking at vacant high street properties so that people can actually buy locally. I think lots of people would buy locally if it was available. So I think we need to use powers for that. And on the second part of the question about co-op ideals, one, I think we need more co-op party councillors. So I'm sure Richard will achieve that in Scotland. He's already increased the number of MSP co-op party members, so I'm sure he will do the same with councillors. But it's also giving our councillors the opportunity to encourage co-ops. So the councils, for instance, have powers over Business Gateway. We need to see Business Gateway reaching out much more into communities and building that support and making sure that procurement is done in a way, on a scale that allows co-ops to bid for those procurement contracts. So I think there's loads of ways. It's about giving our councillors the tools and the information they need to make that happen.
Thank you, Rhoda. Monica, what are your thoughts on those two key questions?
Sorry for the slight delays. I press a few buttons to try and get through the mute control. It's always hard to come after colleagues who've given great answers already, so I would agree with that. And I think really the message for me from tonight as cooperators, I think we have to be confident and take our message out there and ask friends and colleagues and neighbours to join the Cooperative Party, to join us in being cooperators and to grow that movement. And I think part of that is about telling our stories in a way that will inspire people to talk about the great work that people like Joe Fagan are doing, leading the Labour group as a Labour and Co-op councillor in South Lanarkshire. And I think if we can connect that to the vision that we have for our high streets, for our town centres, because I think everyone knows that things won't stay the same and people are looking for a new future and to see that that's going to be a brighter future. So I think if we can talk up the benefits of cooperatives in our economy and what that could do to create new identities and a new sense of community in our town centres, I think that could be quite powerful. And in terms of the budget, because I suppose we think about it, as Labour Party MSPs, but I wonder if there's an opportunity this year around. Daniel is our finance spokesperson, so he might shoot me down in flames, but should we present a cooperative budget, what would we say as cooperators? I don't think we always are as visible as we could be in the Parliament. We all know that we're cooperative MSPs, but is that always clear to others, including the government? So how could we approach the budget? Because in this spirit of cooperation between the SNP and the Greens, maybe we have to elbow our way into that as well, because there is more than one party that wants to do things differently. And I think we can show that we have the values and the ideas to do things differently, because that's what Scotland needs right now.
I think that's absolutely right. So look, I mean, in summing up, I mean, I think that in a sense, I actually really like Richard's introduction that being a cooperator is more than just essentially being supportive of cooperatives. It's actually about how we behave and how we act, and it's about a set of priorities and values. In a sense, in my view, answering those two questions, it goes beyond essentially just the narrow. The narrow focus on just increasing the number of organisations that are formally cooperative. I think it's about extending those cooperative ideals to how we organise and run public services for existing businesses and organisations, ensuring that they actually, they may, even if they're not formally cooperatives, that they actually embrace and adopt cooperative ideals, whether that's inclusive decision-making, representation in governance structures. And these are, I think, are all principles that, I think we should be pushing for. But secondly, I think we as cooperators in Parliament need to be, absolutely at the forefront of highlighting those cooperative principles about how they can be delivered in those policy areas and why they're important. Because, I mean, ultimately for me, I think being a cooperator is about ensuring that people are empowered and valued, whether that's in the place of work, using public services, or frankly, any other aspect of their lives. And I think just on that point, the narrow point, because actually I should acknowledge that the point about how do we double cooperatives actually was explicitly addressed to me. So I better come up with a specific answer to it, which is, I just sort of point to the fact that, and I think in some ways this exemplifies the SNP, they talk a good game about enterprise, and they'll point to the fact that they've created 2 new enterprise bodies and an enterprise board. But the simple fact is, despite all of these new agencies, they're actually spending almost 40% less on enterprise support than when we were in power. So I think, first of all, it's about ensuring that we have, I think, a focus on enterprise. And then secondly, is that cooperative models shouldn't just be a part of that. Cooperative models should be threaded right the way through the support and advice and the options that those agencies are providing to people as they seek to both start enterprises and grow enterprises. And certainly that's what I would like to see. So actually more emphasis on support and actually making sure that we're actually delivering on the ground, but and making sure that cooperative models are actually at the very heart of our approach to enterprise. And indeed, I would say more broadly, actually, in terms of all policy areas, I think put at the very heart of public service design and the proposals that we bring forward, whether that's local government elections or anything else. But look, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. Thank you to my colleagues for being great panelists. Thank you for wonderful questions. I think clearly we are much more stimulating and interesting than our Westminster colleagues, given the questions that we generated. And my final point really is just to ask Richard if there's anything else I need to cover off at the end. Or you should probably do it for me, frankly.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. I'll just wrap up. So thanks to Daniel, to Monica, Rhoda and Paul. I think we're really lucky. That's 4 of our first 11, as Monica. I've been resisting calling it the first 11, but Monica did it. So we have got our first 11 here, and we will be looking to add some subs to that in the not too distant future, so that we can have a real strong cooperative team in the Scottish Parliament and beyond. So I mean, just a couple of things very briefly. On local government, we will be launching 12 ideas for local government manifestos very soon. And we'll be discussing that at our local government conference on the 20th of November. So people who are interested in local government, look out for information about that. Want to thank everybody for joining us today. Make sure you tweet about the event by using the hashtag CoopConf21. The conference continues over the next 10 days or so, with the main business being at the weekend on Saturday and Sunday. And you can find out more details on how to register for free on our website. It's party.coop/conference21. You can hear from Scottish Labour and Cooperative MSP and Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar on Sunday morning. So sign up for that. It should be really good. And finally, do remember that those of us who are in the Co-op Party team, it says HQ in my notes here, but our virtual HQs all over the country these days, from spare rooms and bedrooms and kitchen tables all over the place. We're here to work for you and here to help members, so do reach out to us if there's anything else you would like. So I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight's meeting. Thank on everybody's behalf, in particular our panelists, and wish you all a very good night, and hope that you all keep safe. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.